turn it over to Eva, and then we'll return to the three of you after.
Thank you. I will start in the present and then try to go backwards, or maybe rather presentism, because I think that is some of the problems that we share. And your contributions have been so valuable. I'll get back to that. So this is a much more sort of straightforward summary of the predicament of the Swedish black diaspora, in a way. So it's a bit more squarish and doesn't have any of the sort of poetic, beautiful softness that I'm heard here. So bear with me. So I'll start. So let's see. I would like to begin with stating that I write from an exceedingly exceptionalist national context, something that the artist Juno Kim, who is here today, has thematized in her artistic work together with Eva Einhorn. Among the works are the Society for Swedish Mindedness, the United Nations of Norden, which is a fictive state, or fictive unity, which have links to the project Allt för alla, Everything for Everybody, a couple of years ago. Please look at those works, by the way, but I will go. Despite its historical and ongoing corrosion, the national image of the Swedish welfare state still provides a basis for discourses on equality, in which words as race and racism are professed to be unnecessary, more or less. They have also been taken out of our legislation, so you cannot talk about the race aspect of racism. People, it is often stated in public discourse, are just wary of the unknown, and that is often as far as we get. As many have argued before me, such as Gloria Wecker and Philomena Essex, such discourses in Europe serve to reformulate, salvage, and update purportedly collective imaginings of racial inclusion and white innocence. They furthermore enable a continued hold on the public imaginary, and by extension orchestrating and setting the limits of the thinkable and speakable in contemporary power-evasive media debates on race, where democratic values, within Marx, serve as watchwords for dialogue. We should all find a common ground. Swedish cultural investments in political innocence have been grounded in collectively held images of being historically exempt from colonial involvement and racializing structures. As several scholars, including myself, having claimed, Sweden has come to imagine itself as a raceless, tolerant country, which is purportedly less affected by post-colonial relations than other nations. Our part in global history involving the active participation in the transatlantic slave trade and in anti-black genocide has been, and to a large extent continues to be, forcefully denied in Sweden. Studies on it certainly exist, but continue to remain unheeded in everyday culture. Our history of welfare politics and our contributions to egalitarianism, diplomacy, and foreign aid are well known globally. Throughout after-war and contemporary history, Sweden has marked and marketed itself as a moral superpower, a haven of democracy and neutrality. As Katarina Skog claims, Swedish collective identity involves imagining our country as a deterritorialized, ethereal space, once deterritorialized ethereal space once inhabited by noble Hyperboreans, the whitest of the white of the north. To be black in Sweden, you could say, is therefore complicated in many ways and has been explored by a growing group of scholars and free intellectuals and activists. And I can mention a few: Michael McEachran and Louis Faye, Lena Sawyer, Ovidio Plait, Mariam Kanyama, and also Maimouna Abdullahi, who we listened to 2 days ago about the Burqa songs 2.0, Fanan Dao Norby, Elisabeth Katja Susanna, and so on, and many more. In order to address the specific predicament of the black populations in Swedish and Scandinavian context, I just quickly want to highlight the many ways in which it is tied to the broader European discourses regarding the relationship between everyday anti-black racist oppression and our limited power to fight it. In several ways, European nations share a deep collective investment in normative colorblindness, and this is something you're already familiar with, departing from a welfare and democracy saturated, self-congratulatory, and not to forget, very liberal-minded white supremacy that refuses to acknowledge its own existence. What gives particularly Sweden's national self-image its staying power is that it relies on an automatically, principally inclusive collectivity based on an unexamined presumption that equality stands in a metonymic relation to racial/non-racial/white sameness. I also want to point to some of the ways Sweden differs from our local and regional neighbor countries, since Sweden has lagged behind many other nations in getting to grips with its colonial past, significantly by recurrently silencing any serious public discussion about our colonial history. We had a lot of catching up to do. Yet, in accordance with so many other Western contexts, black people here, as much as elsewhere, are expected to provide the emotional and educational labor in informing white people about the meaning and consequences of anti-black racism in ways. As much as this is an impossible task, we are not let off the hook, I would say. We are required to speak from what Christina Sharp calls the non-place of black social death. And I'll hope to return to that because she has a passage that is just so important. Yet we're not allowed to describe the ways in which the dehumanization that is already in place for every encounter and debate endangers us. In the article, The Machinery of Dehumanization, the free intellectual Egbert Alejandro Martina critiques the logic according to which state-sanctioned anti-racist agencies address the problems of racism in the Netherlands through what Martina calls itemization of racism into racist events, actions, and incidents. He writes, "The purpose of neoliberal state-sanctioned anti-racist politics is thus not to bring about the end of an anti-black world, but to redirect anti-colonial struggles into safe business models, such as an anti-discriminatory agency, which in a larger sense manage, redirect, and diffuse black rage. These agencies give us a false sense of hope." Martina elucidates how the stubborn refusal of reciprocity and accountability gets black people bruised, manhandled, and killed, both socially and literally. Social or factual death is evident in his writing, and he elaborates, quote, "As black and non-black people of color, we need to think about how we understand anti-racism, by which I mean we need to reckon with the biopolitics of anti-racism, the ways through which some black lives are marginally fostered and supported, while other black lives are made vulnerable, difficult, or impeded to the point of death. The devastating irony is, as Saidiya Hartman notes in Fugitive Dreams, that people in Western societies are less vulnerable because we are safely situated within the enclosure of empire and foreign capital, which is the very same force making the lives of Africans vulnerable and disposable. The semblance of humanity of black folks in the West is brought about and maintained through accumulated structural adjustments, the ongoing paternalistic colonial project of fashioning black people into human beings deserving of rights. End of quote. We may remind ourselves that these things take place during what the United Nations have declared the International Decade for People of African Descent. It started 2015. Even though I have yet to take stock of what is actually being done so far, my preliminary guess is that few material efforts have been made in Europe apart from the production of reports, and especially here in Sweden. I am myself presently involved in putting together the latest version of one of these reports on anti-black racism on the working market, and hope to be able to make some kind of difference. Reports are also tricky things. In another text by Martina called Playing the Numbers Game, he argues, in a context in which the concept of institutional racism is still treated as a myth and the experience of black people are discredited or downplayed, the statistics generated by the Notification Center for Online Discrimination provide black people with a reasonable and objective basis to argue the reality of anti-black racism. Meaning racist incidents is a way to translate the violence of racism into workable terms. However, this demand for workable formula and unequivocal proof strains our eyes to focus much more on taxonomy than politics. This, in Martina's words, is another example of the stubborn itemization of racism. He continues, at this point it should be indisputable that there are inequalities in the Dutch political, educational, judicial, and legal systems, and in the housing and labor markets. Countless state reports with facts and statistics about racial inequality have been produced, and yet black people are still expected to prove the reality of structural racism. We suffocate under the weight of evidence and the expectation that we attend underneath that burden to the white demand for detectable and unambiguous proof in the face of racial violence that is gratuitous and structural is perverse, even when the evidence presented is unambiguous. When something recognizably racist has taken place, it is still made subject to argument. End of quote. This constantly repeated disqualification of the already established knowledge that anti-black racism is extremely violent, health-threatening, and lethal can be juxtaposed with the significance ascribed to reports in our context, in which we are seen as offering breakthroughs of new knowledge. And once written, these reports are almost always treated as working agents in and by themselves. A report has been written indicating that something is also being done about anti-black racism, or racism at large for that matter. But reports are only marginally acted upon, if at all. Usually they remain largely unread and end up in drawers and archives. Again, and knowing this, I hope to make some kind of difference. In accordance with Martina and others writing in what is called Afro-pessimist thinking, I want to point to the presentist and itemizing logic that traps us, because the colonial legacies that are covered over by white amnesia still have a strong impact on our conditions of possibility. Therefore, speaking with Christina Sharp, it is of utmost importance to redact our whitewashed history writing in order to address the ways in which the black diaspora is affected by what Sharp, taking her cue from Saidiya Hartman, calls the afterlife of slavery, in both a US and a global context. One of the most oft-quoted passages from Saidiya Hartman's seminal book, Lose Your Mother, A Journey Along the Atlantic Slave Route, which he read from earlier, provide a strong argument for the many ways in which the colonial aspect of black oppression is not over. She writes, "If slavery persists as an issue in the political life of Black America, it is not because of an antiquarian obsession with bygone days or the burden of a too long memory, but because black lives are still imperiled and devalued by a racial calculus and a political arithmetic that were entrenched centuries ago. This is the afterlife of slavery, skewed life chances, limited access to health and education, premature death, incarceration, and impoverishment. I too am the afterlife of slavery." End quote. In a similar vein, Norbise Phillips' processual account or non-account of her work with her poem on the genocide on the slave ship, The Song, I guess you said it sailed in, or this happened in 1783. Yes, yeah. Brings history to the fore. In it, she sort of brutalizes the possibility of constructing meaning and coherence in similar ways as the historical events took place. And she writes the following: "My intent is to use the text of the legal decision as a word store, to lock myself into this particular and peculiar discursive landscape in the belief that the story of these African men, women, and children thrown overboard in an attempt to collect insurance monies, the story that can only be told by not telling, is located in this text. This self-reflective presence in the text also serves as a diary and a manual, you could say, and I don't know if you agree with that kind of interpretation." She writes, "To not tell the tale that must be told, I employ a variety of techniques. I mutilate the text as the fabric of African life and the lives of these men, women, and children who were mutilated. I murder the text, literally cut it into pieces, castrating verbs, suffocating adjectives, murdering nouns, jettisoning adverbs. I separate subject from verb, verb from object, create semantic mayhem until my hands are bloody from so much killing and cutting. Reach into the stinking, eviscerated innards, and like some seer, sangoma, or prophet, who having sacrificed an animal for signs or portents of a new life, or simply life, reads the untold story that tells itself by not telling." Unquote. The importance of Norbise Phillips and Saidiya Hartman's work here cannot be overstated, and I think that it is sorely needed for getting to grips with the swift-footedness of European anti-blackness, and particularly that of Sweden, that is the most swift-footed I know. The many refusals to hear us, expressed as roots of what I have come to call intersectional escape. The frequent derailings of discussions are all practices that need to be met, not with more commonsensical facts and generalized pedagogical statements about what racism is and how it works. Rather, what we need in Sweden, as well as in Europe as a whole, is the insight that anti-blackness is global, and that it still remains the constituting outside of what signifies the human. Also, importantly, Philip and Hartman's writing indicates that it has become increasingly necessary for black people here to consider resisting the white imperative to respond to anti-black attacks in according to how and with which arguments they are formulated. And mostly they are formulated as invitations to debate. Engaging in the prescribed debate mode keeps us from, as Toni Morrison says, doing our work. I think that it is vital, is a vital part of our survival to disengage with the debates around our existence. Many of us could rather turn our backs to such dialogues on race and instead engage in continuing to examining our local and regional facets of global anti-blackness, engaging in redacting white history writing, as Christina Sharp claims, and saving our energy for rehistoricizing the black diaspora further will be crucial to our survival. Thank you.
Of conversation around these three very rich presentations. And I'd like to begin by giving you some time to respond to each other. I'd like to do that. Things that have occurred to you. I'm not starting you off with a question, but more asking if there are things that you would like to respond to in each other's work. I know you started talking a little bit during the break.
I was struck by Sadia when you said words killed her a second time. And I wondered if you would elaborate on that. I think I know what you mean. Partly, like Zong, the chapter on the dead book is based upon reading the transcript of a legal case, so that the words that memorialize her condemn her to death a second time by not actually acknowledging that as an act of murder, as a violation. So that's the sense in which those words confirm and reinscribe her status as like a human commodity. Right. So, so. Well, the second, I just respond to something that Eva said. I think when you read that quotation from Notander, it's so odd when you write something and then you don't read it for a long time and then you hear it again. And coming after what you read, it seemed to me that I was hearing it with an extra force it seemed very violent. It seemed very violent. That it was an encapsulation. I just had this image of myself trying to break out of it, or somebody trying to violently break out of this contained space. So I think it was after your reading and then hearing you read that, although it was about language and parsing and that kind of stuff, it just assumed another.
Yeah, it had a kind of viscerality.
Yeah.
I was thinking about that too, just in terms of the relationship with your essay on history, and I guess with your language and the relationship to song. We have these the documents, the edict, the legal cases, but then how do we find our way to another kind of telling, to a different story? And I think part of that is about embodied process.
you
Yes.
know? And so in those words, they're about language, but they're not. I mean, we can see all the kind of the bodies that are connected to that, and finding a way to the girl, I had to just think about what is that physical state of embodiment that she's in? What is that experience? What happens to the body when it's turned over? And so, again, to describe it is to be involved in this kind of language of violence and cruelty.
Sorry for not saying anything,
No,
but I'm
that's right.
still sort of forming
Thinking,
questions in my head.
I mean, I said one thing before, and I realized I hadn't followed through on it in terms of permission, and I don't know if either of you want to talk to this, but this idea that, and I don't know if this has ever happened with you, but this idea that I had to seek permission to bring these voices forward, that surfaced during the process of this work. And what do I mean by permission and so on? The way I worked with that, and those of you who do research with archives, know that there's a process you have to go through when you go into certain places and so on. But for me, it meant, I don't know. I mean, those of you who have read the Notanda and have read that I went to Africa and felt that I had to talk to someone about what I was doing. What would have happened if I felt that I didn't have permission? I don't know, you know? I mean, have you ever felt that? And you know, and I asked Sadia a couple of days ago. I said, "Why do you do what you do?" When you gave it, you know, because there are very kind of marked parallels in terms of what you're doing and what I did with Zong. And
Yeah, I mean, I think that, there's not, I think that I take up that question of permission in terms of, you know, what does it mean to kind of give an account of these deaths, Black deaths. And as I was writing this, someone had collected, it was a little volume that was like scholars responding to Venus and Two Acts. And it was, you know, the summer of, you know, Eric Garner, Philando Castile, Sandra Bland. So there were, and, you know, Timmy Rice, so that there were Black deaths that had been recorded, circulated, seen by millions, and to what end? So for me, that difference between kind of witnessing and spectacle is really huge. So how do we attend to in a way that is related to kind of like an ethics of care and radical transformation, rather than just a kind of spectacular reproduction of these scenes of violence? And, you know, what does it mean to witness for one another? You know, what does it mean thinking about that space on the context of the whole, or on the street, or Corinne Gaines, who's making a record of the death that she's anticipating and trying to leave a record for her children. So I think that that's the ethical issue for me. You know, it can't be, it's not, you know, writing as a point of debate. It's not writing as a kind of pedagogy, well, I'm gonna let people know who are indifferent. So it's just about like, how do we sit with, wrestle, and attend? And I think that you were very clear about the kind of the spiritual dimensions of that. And I think I really wrestle with the kind of the political and ethical dimensions of such representation. To what end?
Very important. Yeah.
I think I have a question to you both about the reader, because I admire your sort of, if it's a hidden methodology of presence, in a sense, which sort of hinders, I guess, the white reader from being the consumer of black suffering.
I'm sorry.
Someone wants to reach
Toronto,
you.
Ontario.
But how do you think about that? Because both the song and Lose Your Mother includes so many very graphic details of suffering, and in a Swedish context, it would be like something sort of delicious. But the ways in which you write about it sort of hinders a black gaze a white gaze, I'm sorry, from considering it as consumption, the sort of momentary empathy and grieving.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really, that's actually a very good question. I mean, I think that it's almost like, from the beginning of this literary tradition that I'm situated in, people have been grappling with that. And so that you have the, and with slave narratives, often you have the kind of the explicit form of address to a white public, and then you have this like implied addressee. I was thinking of like the Intimacy and Life of a Slave Girl. She's explicitly addressing, white women of the North, but her ideal reader is identified as her daughter. That's the person who's understanding and compassion. She really desires, and I think that, I remember Toni Morrison said something about Beloved, and she was saying that, that she wasn't going to make an easy road for the reader to enter that text, that if you came along, you had to experience the disorientation that was a part of this experience of enslavement, that she wasn't going to give you a cushy perch. And I think that in the context of like minoritized literature or world literatures, the forms of explicit address to like a white readership are so clear, right? It's like, okay, this is what you do, invite people in, and I think that I'm not, interested in that project, and I guess I'll say something anecdotally. Once I was at a forum, and Fred Moten was there, and it was in Scotland, and people were talking about these issues of like black life and racism, and a young person in the audience said, well, should we be talking about all these issues with all these white people in the room? And Fred said, oh, are there white people here? And I think that partly, asking that question was a question about, who do you want to be, and what project do you want to invest in, and how do you want to kind of have a relationship to this? So I feel that the ethics of care, the forms of address that the work is involved in are in this space that's kind of deeply, not just the intramural, it's in the kind of, Douglas describes that circle, that kind of critical formation that we're in, where there's the, a formation of thought that can touch and reach others. So others are welcome to enter, but there's not like a path that's carved out for them for easy entry. So Glissant says, our boats are open, meaning that there are things that have produced this experience, but what it has actually enabled is maybe the only kind of, and I'll use that in quote, universalism that's not predicated on these kind of constitutive exclusions, this hierarchy of life. So I would say that we're all at the scene. We're all implicated. This is the history of everyone in this room. But I think that there are certain kinds of disavowals and an unwillingness to enter this circle, not as the kind of, not as a privileged person, right? Not as, the one who's addressed. And I think that my dialogue, as I said in the opening, it's like, it's a discourse with the dead. It's this, it's thinking about that moment as a way to think about our now, and largely how much of the world is situated in relationship to that is either through a kind of utter indifference, through making it a site of entertainment or profit or whatever. So if you can actually show up to be a part of this kind of transformative process of making something else, you're welcomed inside the circle.
Yesterday you asked me and someone else asked me after the small performance, you asked me about certain things that I was doing and that you recognize certain in the objects and so on. And it was Marina, she did. So, I think it's interesting that one of the defining ideas that this article by Mbembe talks about is secrecy. And of course, secrecy is very central to a lot of African practices. And I think, and I've read, that it's not so much because even in Western society we have lots of secrets, you
Yes.
think of the Secret Service and all the way things have been coded, you can't get access to certain things. So it's not just that these primitive societies work with secrecy. All societies are working with secrecy, and those who are let in and those who are not let in, and protocols you have to go through to have access to it. So I think that's an interesting idea there. And I'm not in the academy. I call myself an unembedded poet and writer. And one of the challenges for me is that the kind of work that I do means often that the work is not easily digested. It takes some work, and to survive that becomes very difficult because the work isn't widely commercial. And in fact, that's how I began to write fiction. I thought, okay, I have this habit, which is poetry, and I have to support the habit. So I'm going to write fiction, and that'll pay for my habit, right? So Harriet's Daughter, my first young adult novel, was written in that way. And I was looking through, I wasn't being rude, because I know there's a piece in this book, Blank, called Interview with an Empire, in which there's an asshole interviewer who's interviewing me, but it's actually me interviewing myself. and there's a section in there where I talk about the fact that if my work gags and you have to throw it up and kind of take it in again and try and swallow it, that's okay. That I don't want the work to be something that is easily digested. But that, there's that, and then there's the market. So I'm just sort of throwing these ideas out as a writer who's not in the academy, where that sort of thing is probably more possible, more easily. Being outside of the academy becomes a problem of survival. As you spoke, I was thinking this idea that Glissant talks about, opacity. So you recognize certain things. Marina from Brazil recognized certain things, and I believe you said something too. I think your background is Southern Africa. So people who I suppose know about certain practices will see certain things within the work, but it's much more than that in some ways. what I feel is, to echo what Sadia is saying, is that there's a sense in which, and I was very conscious of this, that the work contaminates everybody. But that there's a choice to be contaminated. But I think what I was trying to get at is the fact that we're all in this. We're all contaminated, even those of us who have been victimized. In the sense that where I live in Canada, where those of you who are African and or Asian and so on, who live in these, as you talked about these, oh no, it was you, these, or quoting Sadia, you live in these enclosures in the West, just by virtue of being there, we participate in these systems that exploit others. So I cannot pretend that my hands don't have blood on them. And how do I work with that then? So, yes, there is a sense in which everybody is invited in because the work is there, but I do think that there's also a sense in which if the reader is willing to do the work, that there are other layers that could become more accessible. It's like I said in that piece, if somebody thinks that She Tries Her Tongue is a postmodernist work, that's fine. But if you understand the Caribbean, if you take the time to understand the Caribbean, then something else opens up. You then begin to see the Caribbean as a site of massive interruptions, where many of the practices that people were identifying as postmodern also took place there. You could start a sentence in standard English and switch into dialect and switch back into standard English and all those kinds of things. Yeah. So, and the last point I want to make about that is, as it's a humbling situation that. I too have always thought of Zong as coming out of this idea of colonialism, fragmentation, modernity, all those ideas and realities. But then I began reading some work by an English academic called Karen Barber, and she has done a lot of work on a Yoruba art form called Oriki, O-R-I-K-I, which in its most basic translation is a praise song, and women sing it, some men do as well. There's a particular work, I Could Have Sung All Night, I think is the title. What is interesting, this is an art form that is thousands of years old, but it's fragmented, it's coded. And when I would read some of these Oriki, I thought, this is working very much like Zong is working. What does that do, So for me, it was a humbling experience because it doesn't mean that Zong doesn't come out of this history of modernity and the brutality of colonialism and so on. But it makes me stop and now think these assumptions that somehow the traditional was more continuous and wasn't fragmented and so on. It just begins to make me think more deeply about what it is I am doing. It doesn't in no way denies that Zong resides in a certain set of historical factors, but one historical factor is the Oriki and where some of these histories come from. Yeah.
I wanted to address something that Ilva said about, kind of white innocence as it relates to this, because I think that, white innocence is not only about the disavowal of a legacy of racism and coloniality and structural inequalities, but the thing about white innocence is that it also, the demand is, you address me. I do not know. Teach me. I do not know. Teach me. So it kind of like imposes a particular prison house of address. Mm-hmm. And I think that, certainly in terms of not offering up a certain kind of palatable story or not privileging that subject who always needs to kind of be reminded of what their trajectory in the world has been, right? Mm-hmm. As opposed to saying, oh wait, yeah, that has been the trajectory. How do we break it? And it seems that
you know, that just that kind of refusal to know that's a part of the project of life, innocence, and that's why it's actually, it may be more deadly and costly than racism itself, right? Yeah.
Certainly. And the production of bad faith.
Yeah.
Could I open it up
Yes.
to questions or comments from the room as well? And I'll try to keep track of people who might want to say something. Is it too late and you're all just stunned?
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, I'd like to say just something really short. And it partly connects to, I mean, everything that we've been talking about the past 2 days, but I just want to go back to the work. I mean, the work that's done in theorizing and writing, but also the work that those works require in attention that we talked about the other day. And I'm thinking of Christina Sharp's, in her book, how she uses the word wake, but not only as, I mean, not as, it's, the reason she uses that word, I mean, one of the reasons is that it's not only, it has so many aspects to it, and she returns to it as wake work. And I mean, I think it's that particular wording is interesting because if you're not attentive to it, it can pass by as morning, for example. Like, that's the way to attend, which it's not, because it requires, I mean, the work part of those two words is equally important, or more important even. But there is this kind of, I'm thinking of how, so on one hand, the work itself demands that attention and that work, but there's a way to sidestep that and ignore it, in which case you're spectating it in a way. Otherwise, if you, as a reader, take up the task, that opens up for a kind of systemic or cognitive change, which I think is what's required. And I mean, I don't know if this is going towards the question, but I was thinking of how Ylva worded it very elegantly with, I mean, the fact that you describe all these practices of refusal in conveying or formulating Black Death and anti-Black racism, the refusal of, well, basically the refusal of what you just described, Lydia, the refusal of tell me how it is. So there is, I mean, there are these, I mean, all these different methods come out, they erupt from this class, or the refusal, I would say, which I think, I mean, in Norbez's work, that's almost, I mean, in a way it's so clear in that there's the untelling of the story, which means that the only way you can attend to it is to experience something. You won't get information if that's what you're looking for. But if you understand that that's not what you're looking for, you'll get something else, a kind of opening. Yeah, so there was no question by the end of this, but yeah.
But who said that? I mean, I guess one of the things, because many of my students write about Norbez's work in their dissertation, I mean, there is also, what's produced is also a counter-archival practice or another archive in these texts too. So I think that that's a way that it's not, that it's involved in trying to produce an otherwise. So there's the kind of the dead book that was destroyed by the doctor, so we wouldn't actually have an account of these deaths. Then my attempt to produce like a dead book that can account for the death too, you know. So so I think that we've always been, even as we think of the archive as, you know, this kind of state-sanctioned reserve of knowledge, there have always been these kind of counter-archival or other kinds of archival practices, and often,
those practices are undertaken precisely because there is no audience for this, but we are an audience for ourselves.
Yes, Jim.
Continuing also with the theme of Black Death, I'm thinking specifically of Nobese as well as Sadia, giving examples in Zong and also in the reading we did Sadia about captains of slave ships killing their human, non-human cargo and it not being recognized as murder. And Nobese, specifically in Zong, you explain how property is not capable of being murdered. So I'm thinking, but this is still, this non-human thing seemingly still has a life that can be extinguished. This thing has breath. Breath that has to be suffocated, drowned, put out. So it's an insured object with laboring capacities and laboring futures. So the question I was asking myself is, when does the human become the non-human? And then very specifically at this point of murder, what happens with the recognition that the death that has come about was through murder? With the recognition of murder, I'm asking, do the dead re-enter recognizable humanity? Were lives lost to murder are then seen as human lives, as valuable lives? Or rather, with this, if we were to acknowledge it as murder, are you then maybe demanding the outrage, refusing the indifference, or is this part of witnessing to call it this?
You can't murder property, but you can destroy property. I think that was implied in your question, and the property was destroyed. And I think that's why I spent some time in the essay talking about, and that essay was never intended to be in the book, by the way. It was my working out these ideas. How we got there is a whole other story. But, this is why I say the law is magical. I can, if I have the authority behind me, say that you are no longer human, you are a thing, and a whole series of things back that up. And so I think you're quite right in that Granville Sharp actually tried to get the captain charged with murder. Wasn't successful. And I think what Zong is attempting to do is to reinstate these people into their humanity, even as simply as giving them names, so that they begin to live again for us and continue on in some way. Yeah, that's how I would. I mean, that's certainly how I grapple with that particular issue. A young woman wrote me recently asking me to refer to an essay I have in the Genealogy of Resistance, in which I talk about, there's a history in my family of people changing their names and adding names and this sort of stuff, and I talk about the fact that it seems as if there's a discomfort with the fact that we were renamed, and as if we are condemned to continually try to fit ourselves into different names and so on. And she wrote to ask me, well, how did I resolve that with the fact that I was naming these not unnamed, they weren't unnamed, but their names had been erased, these people who died. And she had answered her own question. She was a student and hadn't realized it, because it's a totally different situation if the one who is terrorizing you, wanting to obliterate you, gives you a name, obliterates your name and gives you a name, and someone who's trying to restore the humanity of the erased is attempting to give them names. Names are so important in all cultures, and African cultures as well. In some cultures, the person doesn't exist until they have a name. you know. So to take that away was the first death. But you know, so I said to her, like, they're two entirely different. So you have to look at the context, I said to her, to understand it's not a contradiction at all. In fact, it's an act of reparation. Yeah.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, no, and I mean, I think that in a way, you know, the captain can't be guilty of murder because the whole, you know, order is founded on the kind of the consignment of this form of life to the other side of like the human, non-human divide, you know, and I think that given the history of the human, that maybe we need kind of a different imagination of species life, and so it's not like that the goal, that there's a violence of not being, you know, recognized as human, but the history of what the human as a category has produced is pretty monstrous. You know, Césaire and discussing colonialism says, you know, the human has produced a great pile of corpses. So how is it that we want to imagine our inhabitation in the world with other life forms, you know, and it seems that, you know, the Anthropocene that we're living now is one, you know, again, one of the outcomes of this conception of the human that I don't think to confer that notion onto the enslaved or to the other or to the native is a gift at all, but just this kind of radical reimagining is required.
Sylvia Winter is a very good one. You're nodding. She talks about this idea.
Do you also want to add something about
No, I think about this question of being humanized, rehumanized after death. And it makes me think about this art piece, this underwater monument in the Caribbean. I can't recall the name right now, but I have images before me. Where these enslaved and drowned people are returned to some kind of, they are people. I don't know if we could.
Turn back on.
We should probably, yeah.
Oh.
So that's. I don't know how that looks.
I think, yeah.
And also this. I think is the most classic. But at the same time, something that bothers me with this monument or monuments is that they are tourist attractions. So,
Again, that spectator witness divide, maybe,
yes,
the spectacle.
yeah.
Can I move on to ask, it's Eva and then Jono. Go ahead, Eva, you're first.
Okay. But, I think I would just wanted to ask if you could maybe any of you could talk about this refusal of the teach me and its relation to the state, and maybe the state's authority in recognizing the human in a sort of contemporary context also. I think it's really interesting to ask that question in order to maybe or think about what it means not to be taught, or like to be this has to do with the innocence you were talking about. Do you understand my question? The
Not
relationship between the refusal
quite.
and the state's authority in recognizing the human. or who counts, or what counts, which behavior, and so forth.
Can I build on your
Yeah,
question?
sure.
Is it okay if we take the two questions together? Because it's kind of, because I'm not a poet and I'm not in law either, so perhaps my question is conflating two very different uses of language that might not be conflatable, but I think I understand what you're asking, which is, in a Swedish context where the word race is not equivalent in the way it's used in English, and therefore, as you said, Ylva, it was at once suggested to be taken out of legal language, and also in the Scandinavian context, police would have a much harder time judging a racially based crime because it's harder to prove than a disturbance of social order, like a window was smashed or something concrete like that. So in a language base that is both social and legally, like having to operate in this way, that's our context here. I was wondering then, because Ylva, you pointed out the weight of evidence, right? Having to prove that this crime or this racial injustice or that it happened, even though we know it happens, but we have to account for it, we have to prove it, we have to give the evidence of it. And so if I understand Ylva's question, it's how do we navigate that, where on the one hand, I don't need to prove that that crime happened because it's so evident in its actuality that it happened, but at the same time the law and the legal parameters that make our society says, no, Juno, you have to have that language, and we need to be able to somehow articulate it, and in that articulation, doesn't the teaching have to, it's a double-edged sword, because I need, in that act of needing to articulate, because I need that legal retribution, I need the justice. So I guess, what I'm interested in is equity and justice, not just outreach, not just, broadened whatever. And so how do we negotiate when we need to go into legal parameters? And can we borrow from poetry? If I understand poetry, it's really looking at structures of language to try and affect or try and shape this quagmire that I feel like we're in Sweden or in Scandinavia, where it is so hard to prove a racially based crime. If I understand, so then without educating, how do we make insertion into how law is interpreted, into how the legal language is structured in Sweden as a very concrete case, is my question. That I don't know if I'm conflating it too much, but I just come to think about it in your presentation.
Can I just add one other thing before you answer, because it seems somewhat that this is like living in a Kafkaesque nightmare. Because if you have to prove it, and the language is not there to prove it in, then what the hell
Exactly.
do you do? Sorry.
Yeah.
It's actually just.
Yeah.
And I think that is one of the core thought of Afro-pessimism, that we cannot settle for adjustments or education and what do you call it, reform, because anti-blackness is already in place. That is a function of society and of the law as such. So, for instance, educating lawyers and judges would help marginally, maybe, but I don't think that it would solve the problem. Do feel free to fill in, because
I mean, in the U.S. case, it's one would say like, can a liberal legal formula provide a justice that can address a structural foundational condition? And no, that's the limits of a certain kind of
legalism. It can't break the structure. It has an understanding of what a racist incident is, and there's a certain formula of causality. Agent A does this to agent B, and you can determine that. But actually, much of, the most kind of, much of kind of the racism that actually is destroying lives and killing us, there's not like the bad culpable agent. These kind of like structuralist processes that every day produce this kind of hierarchy of life where some are disposable. And the state has like a vast storehouse of information. So every time there's a major incident, there's a study of, police practices of targeting black drivers, predatory loan practices from bank. I mean, there's a huge Toyota class action suit in the US because they systematically charged all black people who bought Toyotas higher interest rates. So we have a volume that would document basically structural inequality in health and wealth and research. So what do we do with the knowledge that in fact we already have? We know that our society is structured in a radical racial inequality. The state has produced that. New York City was, sued. Over 400,000 black pedestrians were stopped and frisked. 95% of them weren't arrested for anything. There was many this year as there were before. We know that the practice, but we can't, but the knowledge isn't sufficient to actually break the structure. So that's the paradox, and that's why a pedagogical project doesn't work. I think it's the Kafka's nightmare. I mean, I think that's actually weird, because then what is our investment in things as they are? Why then does this modality continue to be reproduced? Why have people voted for Trump? Why is there this kind of rampage of kind of reaction and racism and fascism also spreading across Europe? What accounts for that resurgence? Right? Is that a pedagogical? Is there a kind of a pedagogy that would make people vote differently, or is it the investment in a certain kind of project because the notion of one's good and one's security and one's status as a human is actually so intimately tied with the subordination and the dishonoring and the precarity of the other.
Can I read a quote about the positioning of black people in Christina Sharp's
Absolutely.
introduction?
And I think that will be our last words for today because we're running out of time, but please do, please.
Okay. And I'll display it a bit unelegantly here. And try to. So let's see. I need to enlarge this. And it is a quote by poet Claudia Rankine, which was published in New York Times, called The Condition of Black Life is One of Mourning, because here she clarifies some of the aspects of the vulnerability and lawlessness of black life. And she writes, though the white liberal imagination likes to feel temporarily bad about black suffering, there is really no model of empathy that can replicate the daily strain of knowing that as a black person you can be killed for simply being black. No hands in your pockets, no playing music, no sudden movements, no driving your car, no walking at night, no walking in the day, no turning onto this street, no entering this building, no standing your ground, no standing here, no standing there, no talking back, no playing with guns, no living while black. And this was written in 2015. Christina Sharp continues, to be in the wake is to live in those no's, to live in the no space that the law is not bound to respect, to live in no citizenship, to living the long time of dread and Harriet Scott. And it's more than that. To be in the wake is to occupy that time/space place construction being in the wake in all of the meanings I referenced. And I'll start there. So from that kind of no position and no citizenship, it is very difficult to adjust society, since the annihilation of black people is already taken for granted. It is inscribed. It is no accident. It is a functioning system.
You want to address that, either of you in any way?
Or maybe, Norbessa, do you want to just give us do you want to read last, maybe one of the song?
Not really. But what I thought,
Your song is there? No, it's right in front.
yes, it's there, but I thought I brought, just a second, bear with me. Oh, Shire, what we didn't do yesterday. You can all read. Yeah. Do you want to help me?
Sure.
So these are pieces of song, and what Shaya and I forgot to do yesterday was I usually end the reading, the performance, by inviting the audience to read with me. And this is the text that's cut up. And I do that because it suggests, for me, it returns the work to the community, which is where it began in the first place. So I just bring those out, and we can all read from pieces of song. And usually I find academics are very shy to read out loud, so, but they're very short, and you can keep, these are artists, I've been told, so. I have to share with you, I think a couple of years ago I was at an event, I think it may be the same event for Axe Idea in Glasgow, and we had a collective reading of song. So we had a little booklet with poems printed and so on. And maybe because they were, many of the people were artists, avant-garde people, there was a moment when I thought, we're going to take this ship. Okay. They were stomping, they were howling, they were, and I thought, my God, we're going to take this ship tonight. But they had a lot more to read than this. Have you had, Sure. You can go back and read again if you like to. And so the other important thing about this little event is that we're not all reading from the same page. And is it possible to do that and yet have something that is not negative? So let's see what happens.
Do we all read simultaneously?
We read simultaneously.
Wow.
Together. Awesome. Meets truth in a pond.
My day, mine
To the labor, you to the light. So lost from mortality, our guns they fire, ground lost tips were fair, nest and made there, the dead, the fires red, roll, tips her own fair, her them, nests and lay, red roll, red roll, red roll, her ruins, her meets truth in a pond, red roll,